All right, so welcome to our refresher from our New England History Day group. I'm Victoria Hughes. I'm the Vermont History Day coordinator at the Vermont Historical Society. And John can introduce himself when it's his turn, but we have John from Maine, we have Geraldine from Rhode Island, and we have Kate from Massachusetts. So a couple of coordinators on today. So thank you for joining us. Today we wanted to talk about primary sources, annotated bibliographies, and student voice, sort of wrapping things in together. We are also happy to answer questions about other things, or if we say something, go into some details, but you need more information about something else, please let us know. We've got a lot of experience on the call here today, and we'd love to help you with whatever you are interested in and whatever brought you here today. So we'll start in with primary sources, and John, if you want to flip the slide. All right, so primary sources come up a lot because History Day does encourage students, challenges students to use primary sources for research as part of the History Day process. And primary sources can be tricky, but primary sources are sort of good in conjunction with secondary sources. If students just use primary sources, that doesn't work. If they just use secondary sources, their projects aren't usually as strong as others that also use primary sources. So sort of having them in conjunction here. So we say we're going to talk about primary sources, but we're also going to talk a little bit about secondary sources. And I decided there are a lot of different definitions of primary and secondary sources. I chose to use the ones that are in the History Day rulebook, just for sort of simplicity. But one of the things that, and we'll talk about this in a couple slides, but primary sources, they kind of might seem straightforward. They're not necessarily always straightforward. But here, the History Day definition, primary sources are created during the time period you are investigating. Sometimes there's also, the added addition that it's firsthand information, but a newspaper can be a primary source even if the reporter didn't have firsthand information, if it's from the time period under study. So, there's some gray areas, and oftentimes students have questions about those gray areas, especially as they are dividing their topics or their bibliography between primary sources and secondary sources. And actually, as I launched right into primary and secondary sources, I hope that's okay. I'm guessing that if you are here today, that you do have some knowledge and experience of History Day. If you have sort of more general questions, we're happy to answer those too. But we also have some other recordings from earlier sessions that go a little more into the nuts and bolts of History Day. So sorry for launching right in, but we'll just keep going. So secondary sources are created after and about a historical event. And for students, a lot of times, the easy example are things like textbooks or biographies or Wikipedia. So different types of resources about a historical event. But I have the example here. We've got the Encyclopedia of Presidents, Calvin Coolidge, a Vermonter. Secondary sources, they provide context, and that is important for students. And oftentimes, secondary sources are a good place to start, either for students to figure out their topic or for students to learn more about their topic before they can dive in to finding and analyzing secondary sources. So they do need the primary sources, and always a great place to start. But once they have that additional information or know that the questions they're asking, then they can really look more deeply into the primary sources. And we do see a lot of projects in Vermont where the students are using primary sources as illustrations on their exhibit boards or pictures in their website, but really the challenge of History Day is using those sources as evidence. So what historical evidence can be found in the primary sources to support the thesis and the argument that is built in part by looking at those secondary sources and getting that initial research. So they do need both, and students do need to separate them as part of the bibliography, and we will talk more about bibliographies later on. So before we go to the next slide, what do you think of when you hear primary sources? What are some places to look for, or what are some types of sources that you would consider a primary source? And if you want to raise your hand or just unmute and call it out.
Letters.
Photographs.
Exactly. Yep.
Oral histories.
News recordings.
Nice. Yeah, so a lot of different places to get that firsthand information or that from the time period. So whether it's an oral history of somebody remembering their experiences, or a news recording that was made at the time under study. And pictures are great, photographs are great, because those are really approachable for a lot of students. And there's usually a lot to analyze in the images that might be sometimes easier than trying to read. Historic documents are great, but sometimes they are difficult for students to approach. Yeah, political cartoons, and I think we're going to see some of those today. So if you want to go to the next slide. These are just a few examples from the Vermont Historical Society. And, we do have the photographs. We have a diary entry here. We have a narrative of, it's The Blind African Slave, a memoir. So we've got a printed narrative, but we also have things like posters. These are bumper stickers, which I find are a fun resource to use that you don't have a lot of space, so you've got to make your argument, or you've got to present your evidence really in a succinct way. We also do, I think a lot of times we talk about papers and documents as primary sources, but artifacts can also be primary sources. This is a license plate here of Abenaki Nation, created in the 1980s, created their own license plates separate from the state of Vermont license plates. And so different ways of looking at types of primary sources. And there are a lot more that students can use and access to include in their projects. Any questions or comments? All right, so going on to the next slide. This is actually, it's a question for you. So here we have a saved Wheaties box. Wheaties, the breakfast of champions. And on the side with was a box where you had to cut out Ethan Allen, and you had to build him by putting the pieces together from the Wheaties box. But there's also some information here, the breakfast of champions, and the thrilling story of Ethan Allen and the red coat. Ethan Allen is a Revolutionary War figure from Vermont, and captured Fort Ticonderoga in 1775 with Benedict Arnold, which Benedict Arnold is not mentioned here in this little blurb. But here, it's one of my favorite primary sources that we have here in our collection. And so I made two of the pieces a little bit larger. But a question for you, is this a primary source? Because Ethan Allen lived in the 1770s. All right, so I like a question, is it part of a campaign? And it is, I cut that part off, but there are others that you could also collect. Other people who fought for your freedom, they're indicated down. I think it's Joan of Arc might be included on there too. It was a couple other, eat more Wheaties and get other characters to cut out. Other thoughts or questions? Is this a primary source? Exactly. So if you're thinking about what are you researching? What is your question? What are you trying to discover? What if you're researching Ethan Allen? No, not a primary source. Technically, this paragraph here, you could consider it a secondary source, although I would not use a Wheaties box as the most sort of.
Handsomest is no worse than Wikipedia. It's just gonna say.
That's true. Well, and they do. I did cut off the part where they said that they did conduct. This information comes from a university scholar. It doesn't say which university or which scholar. But yeah, so this is some information about Ethan Allen. It's sort of a retelling of why he's famous. So not a primary source about Ethan Allen. If you're researching the Revolutionary War, it's not a primary source. But if I told you that this is from 1947, what might it be a primary source in relation to? What might be a research topic that this could be a primary source for? Yeah, World War II propaganda. And so here, this fight for freedom is sort of tied to kind of the purpose of this Wheaties box. Yeah, evolution of Wheaties, what they're selling. Yeah, so this could be a primary source if you're thinking about how was propaganda, sort of the beginning of the Cold War, post World War II. What is that propaganda that we're, Wheaties boxes talking? People all over the world have fought to win the kind of freedom we all cherish. We Americans fight to protect our own heritage of freedom when necessary, but we are constantly striving by peaceful means to achieve freedom throughout the world. So if we're looking at this as propaganda or marketing techniques, that's what this is a primary source for. It happens to be about Ethan Allen in terms of content and picture, but knowing when something is created and knowing the purpose for which it is created, that's going to help students make those determinations of how can they use this? Is this a primary or a secondary source? And then they can put it in their proper category in their bibliography. But also thinking of, different pieces of evidence. You might not go looking for a Wheaties box as evidence of propaganda or evidence of, how what was happening in post-World War II United States. But this is a piece of information that could be a primary source for those different kinds of topics. So, thoughts or questions?
Just a quick thought. I find it interesting that sometimes you can have a source which could be a secondary source or a primary source, depending on how you're using it. So if you have a textbook from the 1940s, you could kind of go either way. So that's it. I think it's an interesting question sometimes looking at students' projects, how are you using it and which category would you put it in?
Exactly. And that's where the annotation can help explain that. And yeah, how you're using it is sometimes as much as what the content is. All right, so I think John is on deck now.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, so thank you for showing that first source there and kind of diving in and giving a little bit of an analysis on how it can be used and how it can be interpreted. One of the ways that I've always kind of looked at looking at primary sources is, and I've done this since college, is I've kind of used the 6 C's of primary source analysis. And this is something that I've actually introduced to students who have come here to my library. I guess I should introduce myself. I am John Taylor. I'm the state coordinator for National History Day in Maine, and I work for the Margaret Chase Smith Library in the University of Maine. And if you're unaware of what the library is that I work at, it is a congressional research library. So we house the papers from the 32-year career of Margaret Chase Smith, Senator Margaret Chase Smith. And so we do have prior to COVID, we had a lot of students that would come through here using our research facility. And this is one of the things that I would use to maybe train them, because they were usually first-time researchers, on how to look at sources and maybe how to interpret it and how to digest it. And so, the 6 C's of primary source analysis that I kind of used is, the first one is content. And what I mean by content is, of course, describe what you see. And when I say describe what you see, what I'm telling a student to do, or even myself when I look at these things, is to be as specific as possible, and to even write down the most mundane things, even write down things that are so obvious that it might be obviously what it is, but you might not realize how important that is until much later down your path of research. And so what I mean by that is, I mean, you want to be specific, like things like, is it in color? Is it black and white? What exactly is it? Of course, if it's a letter, is it scribbled or is it neatly written? That might give you some indication. If it's an audio clip, is there background noise, which might tell you things that's going on in the background? Is there, the inflection in people's voices during an interview or in an audio recording might give you indication of sarcasm or anger or things like that. This will help you decide of how you should honestly analyze the source. And, an example I use is, we have this really nice family photo album of Margaret Chase Smith from the early 19-teens. None of it is labeled. And I'm telling you right now, if you have old family albums, go back and label them, because someone else might have a headache later on about this. And including people who are trying to research your family. But we, none of it is labeled. And so we don't have a lot of those contextual things to look at, or these specific facts to know about people that are in these photos and things like that. And so going through, I passed over this photo, like, it got to be 100 times as I was flipping through this family album. And for the longest time, we only thought that Margaret was only baptized in the Catholic Church. And it wasn't until I finally came across this photo, say the 100th time, and realized she's actually in a confirmation dress. And we actually finally learned, because she never even said that she was confirmed in the Catholic Church. And so it was something that we learned going through family photos over and over, and going through descriptions and then actually describing what she was wearing. And we're like, oh, that finally dawned on us what that was. And so you never know, even further down the line, some specific detail that you might think is mundane there is actually going to help you later on. So that is what I mean by content. In citations, when was the source created? Now, you don't have to be specific. I mean, if you have a newspaper article, something like that, it's likely going to be dated, obviously. But citations are very important, just even if you can get a ballpark. So a really good example of this is I was just taking a course here, actually through NHD, with the Library of Congress. And one of the sources they use is a map that was created by the Peace Corps. Now, they don't have a specific date or year when it was created, but they were able to identify that it was at least after 1963, because it has a zip code on it for a contact information. And that's when zip codes came into play, right? And so that's how we were able to at least figure out it was from 1960, at least the mid 60s, do a circa 1963 type thing. Context is always going to be up to the researcher of how deep they want to get into that context. Now, I'm saying go in locally, regionally, what's going on in the country or the world. Now, depending on what your topic it is, you may not need to get down all to the local level. But, if you're talking about a local topic, of course you do. But, you definitely need to know what some of the trends are going on, either regionally or in your country, or that you're studying, or within the world. So if it's happening during World War II, or in or around it, like the Wheaties box, then you're probably going to want to know that context about World War II. Then connections. How does the source link to the information you already know about and you've learned about your topic? Now, this is something, and this is the one of the 6 C's of primary source analysis that you really want to be aware that is going or should change as your research continues, and that you need to go back and to update your ideas and thoughts on some of these sources, especially as you get further on into your research and you start to kind of dwindle down maybe what sources are most important and things like that. Communication is of course important as well, because is that source reliable, and why or why not? And we could talk about the idea of reliable sources in the media today, but I mean, you could even go further back. So thinking back when I was in college, and I might have this wrong, so please, any of my colleagues, fill me in if I'm doing this incorrectly. But because I'm a Cold War historian, and I'm going to be talking about the 19th century here for a second. I believe, if you're doing research, say like in the Reconstruction era, Gilded Age, and you're looking at newspapers, say the New York Times, even back then, the New York Times kind of leaned more to the left politically, and the Washington Post leaned a little more to the right. And so if you are aware of that, you can kind of know where they might have laid in on a topic or a subject that they're writing about. I might have that switch though. I really can't remember. But also, when you're talking about reliability, I think back in college, and this is of course many, many years ago, we used to say, is it a .com site on you can't trust a .com site, it has to be a .edu site or a .org. But of course that's completely changed. So that you have to also be aware that, these ideas and thoughts about reliability and where sources come from change as well, and you need to be adaptive. So, and then it's also important to know when it comes to communication, what the intended audience was. So if you're looking at newspapers that are abolitionist newspapers, there's going to be a certain perspective and idea that is being aimed at a specific audience. And so that needs to be, I'm just not saying that it's not reliable or not, but you got to know where that that perspective is coming from, and who and what audience they're trying to reach when they're writing any stories in their paper. And then of course the conclusion is, how does this contribute to the understanding of history? And that is, of course, the important part. And that is what brings everything, the first 5 together, right? And, it should either support, disprove, or provide some new detail to you, no matter what topic you're talking about. And so that's the conclusion part of it. Does anybody have any questions? Am I gone too fast on any of that or anything? The great thing is I have created a handy dandy worksheet called the 6 C's of Primary Source Analysis that can be found on the National History Day in Maine web page right now, and you can download it for free. And I'm going to hand that, I'll be sure to get a link out to all of my colleagues here in the Northeast, and anybody who's signed up will send a link to this as well if they want to use this in the classroom. But it's basically just breaks it down and allows students to go in and just write in each designated box there what they see for a primary source and identify it, and will help them organize things. It's much like back in our day when we were in college and we used index cards, right? So kind of like that. But we want to give a couple examples.
John, you're muted.
I don't know why I did that. That's weird.
No, I was trying to unmute myself, and then I ended up muting you. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No worries.
I was gonna say, it looks like Maureen has a question or a comment.
Oh, sure.
I do. I teach 7th and 8th grade,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if you have any suggestions for how to help them source newspapers disposition. I try to have them look at the artist, the editor, the owner, but I find identifying the owner, unless it's like the New York Tribune or it is a Civil War newspaper, hard. Like we're looking at the Scopes trial, and it was the evening. I forget the name of the newspaper, but I said, well, it's out of DC. Why would a DC newspaper be reporting on something that's happening in Tennessee? Like, do they have? So, do you have any suggestions for like how to help students identify the bias of the overall newspaper? Like, would they have a particular audience?
Oh, that's a great question. To identify the actual bias that might be within the paper or an article or coming from a specific paper. Wow. Victoria, please jump in if you have any suggestion. I think that's something that even we as adults struggle with, right? So I can only imagine how much harder it might be for a student. So I think some of the ways to look at that bias would be, and I think one of them you brought up is, of course, you're talking about, say, the Scopes trial, right? So you're talking about the Scopes trial. We know that's in Tennessee, but this is happening in Washington. This article you're looking at is at Washington, D.C., I think is what you said. So, why is a D.C. paper talking about something that is happening that far away? That's got to say something as to how important or perceived importance it is in the greater scheme of things, right? And so that is one way. Man, looking at language would be another way of seeing how people are depicted within the if we're looking at the Scopes trial, how the lawyers are depicted and how some of the arguments are depicted as well. Whether or not there is any, for lack of a better term, snarkiness towards it, or any sarcasm towards what is being said or done, or being addressed towards specific people within there. Is it balanced? So I think would be another one where if there is arguments, or say there's report on something specific, how much of one side or the other is being told, or is it being is there an even amount given on each side of a story, or even three sides of a story? Not that it's just two sides. Do you have any suggestions, Victoria, as well?
I mean, one sort of bigger suggestion, but really not for middle schoolers. If this were your graduate thesis, you would probably read more articles, and not just the article that you're using for your argument, but other articles. And, over sort of a course of looking at different articles, that might be a way to help. But you, just looking in one place, if they're letters to the editor, not all of the papers are going to have that, but if there's a place where they're printing things that people have written in, looking at some of those of what the paper is choosing to print might help a little bit of figuring out who, if they have a bias or what their bias is. And as John was saying, who is this targeted to? So maybe a little the demographics of what city they're in. I mean, DC is sort of in the middle if we're thinking like north and south, or looking at different perspectives. But knowing who is because at that time, other than like New York papers necessarily, people might be reading more local papers. And so knowing who the local audience might help a little bit. But even I'm impressed, even if you're having just the students try and figure out who the publisher is, that is great digging already, going further than just saying what the title is and what place it was published. So I think you're already setting them on a great track for trying to figure out more of the context of the source.
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully that helped. I mean, like I said, it can be a tricky thing, but I think even just with practice and exercise. So even if there was examples that we already know what those biases are, and as they were given to students as examples to maybe kind of dissect and digest a little bit, that might actually, start their little radar in their head to actually identify some of that as they're working on their own projects then as well. But speaking of giving out some examples and doing a little bit of exercises, I'm going to give a couple. We're going to give a couple examples from our own institutions, and I'll start. And we're going to talk a little bit about gender representation in the media, and then we'll talk about child labor, and then and some of the sources that are connected to that. So let me see if I can make that move. Now, like I said before, I work at the Margaret J. Smith Library here in Skowhegan, Maine, for the University of Maine. And before we talk about a couple sources from my library, I just want to give a little bit of context, because that is one of the C's, right, of primary analysis. And so I'll make this quick but if you are unaware of who Margaret J. Smith was, and actually it was her 124th birthday yesterday on December 14th. She was born in 1897, and she graduated from Skowhegan High School here in Maine. It's a small mill town. In 1916, she was on the high school girls basketball team, and she was the state winning basketball team in 1916. And it was considered state winning because they went undefeated that year. She was elected to the House of Representatives after her husband, who was a U.S. representative, passed away in 1940. She took over his seat, and then she was elected 4 times to the House, and she served on the Naval Affairs Committee at that time. And then she also helped women get actual permanent status in the military in 1947. She was the one that helped push that bill through after all the everything that women were did during World War II. A lot of them didn't have permanent status, so which meant they weren't going to get any benefits for their service. And so she wanted to make sure women did have that right. And so she helped to get that status there in 1947. 1948, she was elected to the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate. And during her time from 1949, when she was sworn in January 49, to when she left in 73 of January, she served on the Armed Services Committee and served on the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee. So 2 very important committees in the Senate, one of them which helped find funding for NASA to get people into space and to get people on the moon, right? In 1950, she stood up to Joseph McCarthy during McCarthyism and the McCarthy Red Scare. She was the first one to do so. She stood on the Senate floor only a few months after he started his witch hunts, and called him out, not by name, but called him out. Everybody knew who he was talking about. And within a few weeks, there was already talk about her possibly being a vice presidential candidate with then General Eisenhower. She did actually run for the presidency in 1964. She wanted to prove a point by running only on her record, so by not taking any campaign contributions. And everybody else on the Republican side had less experience than her, and she wanted to point that out, and that's that she was much more qualified to be the person to run for the Republican Party. And she became the first woman to be placed in nomination by a major political party at a convention. And then in 1972, she lost re-election. 73, she was inducted into the inaugural inducted class of the National Women's Hall of Fame. And then in 89, President George H.W. Bush gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor a civilian can receive. And then she died in 1995. So I'm giving you this nice little bulleted list of her accomplishments. And that's because we want to talk a little bit about gender. And that is, someone brought up political cartoons earlier in this talk. And I love political cartoons, and I especially love looking at the ones that Margaret is depicted in or that she's part of. And one of the reasons is there are nearly 500 cartoons that she was depicted in. And one of the reasons is because during that time, she was the only female for a very long time in Congress, and cartoonists get tired of drawing the same men in suits all the time, and they wanted to draw something different. But what's interesting is looking at a lot of these different cartoons is you can see some of the gender bias or gender stereotypes that are within those cartoons. Even though she's a very accomplished woman, I've just given you a bolded list of a lot of the accomplishments that she did. She was the first woman to be elected to both houses of Congress. I forgot to mention that as well. But a lot of these are connected to when she ran for the presidency in 1964. She made her announcement in at the end of January of 1964, then started, and she only ran 3 primaries: New Hampshire, Illinois, and Oregon. And she was able to actually come in second place to Barry Goldwater at the National Convention to become the nominee for the Republican Party. But a lot of these, again, are connected to her run in 64, and you can see a lot of the gender bias. So up here at the top with throwing the hat in the ring, you can see all these different men's hats up here, and then you see a woman's hats right here. Down here in the bottom lower left, you can see that there's Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater. Both are Republicans, but one is considered more liberal, one's considered way more conservative. And she kind of said that she was the one in the middle of the conservatism movement at that point. But yet you can see she has a muffin pan, right? And she actually gave out her favorite blueberry muffin recipe in New Hampshire when she was campaigning out there. And in response to that, Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York at the time, gave out his favorite fudge recipe. Down here with her fishing with Barry Goldwater, this is when she narrowly defeated him in the Illinois primary. And here he is asking in this cartoon, why can't you just stay home and play with dolls? Again, there's a little bit of a stereotype right there. I said she was with space flight, with the Aeronautics and Space Sciences Committee, women in presidential candidate, and there's a rolling pin as the rocket ship that's going up there. And then of course we have all these men's track shoes and then her high heels here as well, running for the presidency. So these are some obvious gender stereotypes that are being portrayed, right? This is one that I always like to show my students that come here to the library. And because a lot of the students that come here, it's usually their first time, like I said, coming to a library and coming to a research facility and actually diving in and looking at some of this stuff. So I will ask them, what do you expect to see here today as you go through and start trying to research your topics? And a lot of them be like letters, pictures, they'll say things like that. And I was like, absolutely. And the majority of our collection is correspondence, right? And so as they go through that, I will tell them, you need to actually think in 2 different ways. You're going to see the most obvious things, right? Some of those gender stereotypes, like I showed in the political cartoon, or someone spelling out exactly what they mean or what they say in a letter. You're going to be able to understand that. But it's also important to understand what is not within a source. And so this is the example that I always like to give to them. And this is Margaret's Kitchen, which was in the Ladies' Home Journal in November 1956. And if you are unaware, our library is actually connected to her house. And so we actually take our students through the kitchen. So I have this discussion as we're standing in the kitchen that I'm talking about. But it was featured in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1956. So by this time, she's 16 years into her congressional career. She has run successfully for both houses of Congress. She has stood up to Joseph McCarthy. She's been on the Naval Affairs Committee. She's on the about to be on the Aeronautics and Space Sciences Committee, and she started on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. She's a very powerful politician. All right, and she's only getting more and more powerful and more rank within the Senate and with her colleagues. And what do they focus in on in this article? Solely her kitchen. Nobody talks about any of her political accomplishments or her accomplishments that she has either done for the country or for her home state of Maine. And so I asked them, what does that mean? And of course, they don't necessarily know how to say it, but they get it, and they can start kind of discussing and digesting that, yes, this is a gender stereotype, that at that time in 1956, Ladies' Home Journal thinks that women do not or are not interested in politics, and so they do not focus on that element of it. They only talk about Margaret's Kitchen. And now when I have older generations come through and we give tours of the house, they'll say, well, it is the Ladies' Home Journal. I'm like, that's exactly my point. This is they are, there's a perceived notion that women would not be interested in hearing about some of the things she's been doing in Washington. And so again, I always try to say you need to think a little bit deeper and think a little bit harder when you look at some sources such as this, because it's not only what is there on the page, but what might not be there as well. I do see a chat here. Is it part of the politics of respectability for her to appeal to women voters? Yes, it actually, that is a little bit of part of it as well. Yes, thank you, Maureen. Yes, that is part of it. And she did toe the line a little bit when it came to that. I don't know if that's the right term I should be using with that, but she did focus in on that. And she did still have these ideas on separate gender roles when it came to women and men. And she would mention those in speeches as well. So yes, that is part of it as well. And so with that, I will turn it over to Victoria so she can talk about her source from her institution.
All right, thank you. And I have an example here of a photograph, and this is child labor, and child labor is one of those topics that fits a lot of History Day themes, definitely fits debate and diplomacy for this year. And I see projects from students a lot of times who do use primary sources as illustrations. They might have the print of a newspaper on their board or in their documentary. But for students, when they take it to the next level, is actually using these primary sources for evidence. And so here, this is a pretty typical Lewis Hine photo from Burlington, Vermont in 1916. But here, one of the things I like about this one is being able to talk about primary sources and how they have, as John said, perspective, they have bias in them, but also in thinking of Lewis Hine as a photographer, of making choices and thinking about how we can find evidence in this image of the debate, of maybe diplomacy, how you want to frame it. But thinking, what evidence, here's my question, what evidence in this photograph and the caption that is below proves that Lewis Hine actively fought against child labor? He wasn't just going around taking pictures. What choices did the photographer make that shows Hine is actively fighting against child labor? You can join in or add into the chat, or.
Does this include the caption at the bottom?
Yes, so yep, the caption at the bottom. Morris Levine, 212 Park Street, 11 years old and sells papers every day, been selling 5 years, makes 50 cents Sundays and 30 cents other days. And this is from the Library of Congress because it's a Vermont photo, but we don't have all the collections, so Library of Congress is great for finding primary sources too. Yep, good, noticing the snow in the kid's face.
I would say the caption as well,
Mhm.
because I mean, he's pointing out 11 and has been doing this for 5 years. So been doing it since 6 years old.
Yep. I also love the placement here next to the amusement arcade in the basement. This poor little boy is probably not going to the amusement arcade in the basement. And also, yeah, next to the sign here for a movie. And I do love how this helps. Yeah, exactly. Placing him against the sign gives you a guess of his size. I probably wouldn't have guessed that this kid was 11 years old, but put him next to a sign. And so, maybe Lewis Hine was choosing the smallest, shortest, youngest newsboy, which he often, was making choices into whose photographs he was taking. But yeah, the whole thing about the composition of this photograph provides evidence. So a lot of times, students will just put up pictures, but they can go further if they can use the pictures or the documents and say, and sometimes like if they're writing this and then they can chop this part out because, they don't have too many words, but using a stem of like, this photograph shows, or this document proves, and then they can take that introduction out. but using these for evidence as part of their argument. And that ties into our next topic. Student voice is something, and this is from the performance category of the rubrics. And just to make sure everybody is aware, NHD went to this format last year, but they have also updated the forms for this year. So using feedback from judges and from teachers and looking at, how things were filled out last year, NHD has gone back and made some changes to the judging forms for this year, to the rubric. So they are updated this year if you need to see those. But student voice is something that was introduced last year. In part, it seems to be, I know we were seeing a lot of projects where the students were quoting secondary sources, which I think partly was a way around, not using too many words, but also sometimes, students, they see that somebody does well in a contest quoting secondary sources, so then the students start doing that. But as historians, that's not something, we certainly read secondary sources and we use information we gain from them, but a vast majority of the time, it is better, unless you're quoting from primary sources, it is better for the students to put their argument and their ideas into their own words. So not quoting from secondary sources. And here, the student voice piece is really encouraging that. And I know I talk about, History Day is something where the students get to be historians. And this is what historians do, is they analyze, they build their own arguments, they use their own words to make their own arguments. It also helps students get away from plagiarism, whether accidental or intentional, but really highlighting the student voice. So, so exemplary student analysis is consistently clear and balanced between their own words, ideas, and supporting evidence. So they still need to use the supporting evidence, but making their own arguments. And I see a lot of students who have like their thesis, it says thesis on their board. They don't need to necessarily have thesis written out on their boards or their documentary or their website, but it should be clear what that thesis is, and that all of their words and their argument and their analysis helps prove that thesis and provides evidence to support that thesis. And so that is something that judges are going to be looking more for in terms of projects. John, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've covered that.
Okay. And this is something, as the forms change, we are all sort of getting used to them and figuring out how they work. And let us know if you have questions about the new forms, or sometimes, if we get questions, we go to the national office and see what the official word is, but it is something that we're getting used to. But in hopes that, like, the old forms didn't always give a lot of feedback back to the students, so that this is a format with the rubric that they're more used to, but also that it provides more information to the students, especially if they're going to go to another level and revise their projects. And you can go to the next slide, which goes back to the Lewis Hine photograph.
Oh, I would point out that Kate from Massachusetts did say that she worked on the revisions for this year's form. So if you have any questions, go to Kate.
Yes, because she's spent a lot more time talking about this than I have. So here, this hopefully, it's a bit of a loaded question. Hopefully, to the question, which is a better example of student voice, it is that it's the student written words. It's not the quote from a secondary source, where the secondary source talks about what Hine was doing. It's the student, well, in this case it was me, but the student who would be talking about what Hine was doing, and saying that Lewis Hine intentionally photographed Morris Levine, a tiny 11-year-old newsie, standing near leisure activities the working boy could not afford. And so, rather than quoting somebody else or quoting a website, and there's actually a great website The link is on the previous version, the previous slide, but it's Mornings on Maple Street, where a researcher found a lot, sort of got taken in by some of the photographs of the children and started to find more information about the children and what happened to them as they grew up, and what happened after they were photographed by Lewis Hine. So it's a great website and it has a lot of great information, but it's not something that the students should necessarily be quoting. They can use it for research, but put it into their own words, and using their own words will get them more higher on the rubric of good use of student voice.
Would you have them try to connect how he worked with, I want to say, the Labor Commission to put pressure on Congress to break up the filibuster? I was thinking, like, could they be using maybe some of the theme words about how his pictures kind of spurred a debate that put pressure on Congress to pass a child labor law?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think, and this is just a little blurb, and like, I don't have a thesis and I don't, didn't do the larger part of, an argument here. But yeah, definitely using those theme words and building that in, and that, one photo, and Hine took thousands of photographs, but one photograph can be tied to that argument of the debate and what his intentions were. And the idea that it wasn't just documenting these child workers, it was actively trying to improve their situations and use the documentation as evidence. And if they can build in those theme words, and this, whether, like, if this were on exhibit board, whether this paragraph is next to, this would probably be next to a photograph, and then they would have the caption or the citation information under the picture, but that whatever they can do to connect the primary sources to their argument and get those theme words in, that is going to be a better project for the students.
Next slide, or no. Awesome, almost there. So we're going to do a little bit coverage of annotated bibliographies. Basically, what we wanted to touch upon when it comes to what should be expected, or what judges typically expect from the annotated bibliographies, are the do's and don'ts here. And it's a fairly small list, but what an annotated bibliography, and I actually took this from a university website, I believe even my own university, is a list of resources that include, what is a bibliography? A list of resources that include a citation followed by a brief. So brief meaning 1 to 3 sentence paragraph that describes the source and provides the information on its usefulness. And so that is something that especially Victoria has alluded to a couple of times now when talking about sources and how it can be interpreted, right? So there is, and I've been on judge groups many times where they will go through the bibliography and they'll see a certain cited source, excuse me, and they will ask, well, why are they considering this primary instead of secondary? And maybe for part of the time, it's just because there's not a clarification in the brief paragraph or 2 or 3 sentences that is describing why they are looking at it the way that they are looking at it. And it's not until you get into the interview process and you speak with that student or that group of students where it's actually explaining. It's like, oh, okay, now I get it. And so that's really the reason for the annotated bibliography. It's to give you an idea of why it's being used, how it's being used, and giving you any other pertinent information, of course, of where it can be found, I guess is what I should say. So a lot of the do's and don'ts are pretty standard and pretty straightforward. Now for NHD, Chicago or MLA style citation is allowed. Now typically Chicago is what historians use, but we also know that not all students are going to need to learn Chicago at some point. So we know that MLA is important for students to learn. And so, and it is sometimes a requirement in some school districts that they learn MLA. So this could be used as a way to do that. Be sure to summarize the theme and the scope of the source. So be sure to, everything that I just said, how it's being interpreted, why it's being used, and then where it can be found, and explain how that source ties into the purpose, the idea, or the theme of your project, or the thesis of your project, and how it's helpful to you. So, that it could be broken down in 3 sentences right there. So, if you can explain how it goes back to your main argument, that is also an important thing to remember. Now, the other thing that a lot of judges and coordinators will notice when it comes to annotated bibliographies is that students like to pad their bibliographies, and that's a big don't. So if you are using a source, please, by all means, put that source in an annotated bibliography and explain to us or the judges how it's being used. But don't just start throwing in everything willy-nilly. So even if you've maybe consulted, I don't know, let's say Wikipedia, because that's where you start sometimes, right? You just need to get some sort of contextual idea. That doesn't necessarily mean that got you anywhere. That just kind of gave you an idea.
John, I am going to jump in. One of the
Uh-oh.
changes with the rubric
Uh-oh.
is that
Are we
we
gonna
want
fight?
all sources consulted. So this doesn't have to
Oh.
be anything that they looked at, but if there's something that they read, even if it doesn't end up being quoted in the project,
Really?
that should go into the bibliography. That was one of the changes, because even if you read something but you don't necessarily quote it, it still could be influencing what you're writing and how you're thinking about it. So this becomes a little trickier. Don't throw in the entire kitchen sink, but if they start off with a Wikipedia article, for example, you might say, hey, I looked at this and then I looked at the source list at the bottom of Wikipedia. They want to talk about how they used it. So it still has to be something they used, but it's gotten a little bit more broad.
Apparently it has. I wasn't part of those discussions. Sorry, folks.
Yeah. But I would also say if students look at something, because you look at a book and you realize it's not useful at all, that doesn't have to go in there. If you look at it and say, oh wait, I'm not going to use this, because then it just becomes too difficult for the students and it becomes cumbersome. But yes, if it's something that
this is exactly where that description in the annotated bib comes in, right? You still have to tell us why and how you used it. And if it was like, I read it and it led me to these other 3 sources, that's great. If you're like, I thought it looked interesting and it was on the topic and I put it in there, that's not so great.
Yeah, so thank you for that clarification, Kate.
Well, and still judges do not want to read 50-page bibliographies.
They do not.
And teachers don't want to either, and you don't want to print that much.
Yeah, so as someone who's judged many times, that is definitely not something that we want. I also do not just cut and paste or plagiarize the abstract of, say, an article or anything like that. We want that still to be in a student voice and student words of how it was used and what it is. And do not use this as an opportunity to get around the word limit. That is done quite a bit in papers, to be honest with you, it's been seen a lot by papers where they get around using the student composed words of between 1,500 and 2,500 words in the paper, and they'll go back into the abstract and then or the annotated bibliography, and they'll add more and more info back there as a way to get around the word limit and to try to impress judges more. So don't use them in that way. Again, it should be very short and succinct, 1 to 3 sentences for a paragraph. I see 2 things here up in the chats. In case I had a case where a student took a bibliography from a previous student project, they still need to write their own bib. Of course, yes, absolutely. It's definitely part of it. So I believe, aside from that, there are a few, I keep moving my little box around here, additional resources that we have, of course, connected to NHD with the annotated bibliographies and the sample bibliography that they give on their website. Which will help out. And then we did give a couple of broader places where they're great collections for people to use. Victoria, you put this list together. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, well, what I can send the slides out to everyone, but I will say, as historians, we would love to see students in archives and come to our collections and libraries. But between COVID, between the realities of student research, we know that they're going to do a lot of research online. And I always tell the judges, it's okay. It's okay that students research online, because there are some great resources available online where the students still need to do searching, they still need to do analysis. And it doesn't matter that the collection is online. It's great that the collection is available, and you don't have to go to the New York Public Library, because they have an amazing amount of resources that are digitized, and places are doing more. So I'll send these out in case these are some links that you don't have. But I will also say, as a coordinator, I love helping to send students to the right repositories and places to look. So if you have questions, or students are stuck and having trouble finding primary sources, please check in with coordinators. We're happy to help send students in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Always enjoy to try to hook students up with the right repositories to get the information they need. I'll give a brief and quick shout out to the Osher Map Library. It's one of the best map collections I've ever seen. It's great, and they have a lot of it digitized. And I'm also very, very good friends with the director of that library, and she and her team do an amazing job there. So I think she's actually judged for NHD Maine a few times as well. So. We're right past our time, so I just want to, we want to be aware of your time. If there are any quick questions, we're more than happy to answer that. If not, oh yes, Maureen said Osher Map Library is a great source for creating lessons. Yes, and they actually have some lesson plans there for you available as well. If not, we are always available through our email, and you can find that through various ways, NHD website and our own program websites as well. But do you want to add anything, Victoria, at all?
No, just to apologize that we didn't actually create a slide that had our contact information on it, but I will send everyone a follow-up with the slides and with our contact information. Yeah, and does anyone have any questions or comments now?
I do want to thank everybody for actually participating.
Yeah.
And
yes, thank you for coming. I know it's dark here, and it's the end of the day and end of a long year. So thank you for participating and coming to our session today.
yes, hope to see everybody very soon.
Thanks for running this.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to stop the recording now.